Okay, so this is going to be a history video, which is a subject that fascinates me. And I'm going to be talking about one of history's most fascinating figures, as well as one of history's most controversial figures, and the consequences of these issues in relation to empire and how we perceive different people in different contexts, in different places, in different times. So there's a number of things I want to bring into this. I'm going to do not exactly film reviews, but I'm going to reference some films in doing this. So the figure I want to talk about is Genghis Khan, Chinggis Khan, Genghis Khan, whatever way you feel is the right pronunciation. I've heard it all three ways, incidentally. Um, to most people in the West, when you say the name Genghis Khan, the immediate sort of stereotype that comes to mind is a fierce Mongol warlord on horseback, um, raiding and pillaging, striking absolute terror into anyone who crosses his soldiers' paths. And this stereotype is largely true because the Mongol conquests and the Mongol Empire, which is a slightly abstract term because there was various conquests over time. I'm not sure if it could ever be called a single unified empire at any single point, but the Mongol conquests, most historians agree, were incredibly destructive. In fact, the scale of sacrifice in human life was so great that forests that were cleared in these conquests would apparently not grow for years afterwards, or they would grow over, or there was something to do with, I forget the exact analogy now, but it was to demonstrate the sheer scale of this destruction. I'm going to show you the covers of two films I've just watched. Already had these. By the Will of Genghis Khan and Mongol. These are both Russian language films. One's directed by Sergei Bodrov from 2007. The second, not sure who the director is. Of the two films, I think probably Mongol is slightly more convincing as a film. But basically, both films touch on the similar themes as laid out in the documents, The Secret History of Genghis Khan, which was written after his death, or at least published after his death. Indeed, a lot of his reputation comes from after his death, which is true of a lot of great figures in history. But basically, the story goes that Ahmed's a very difficult and challenging childhood in which he was cast away from his own tribe due to various feudal disputes. He eventually worked his way up to unify all the Mongol tribes. This came amidst many questionable background circumstances, including a huge fallout with his childhood friend Jamulka, who himself became a leading general, leading commander. Um, I think when it comes to Genghis Khan, a lot of this does come into that saying that history is written by the victors. So today in Mongolia, the modern day state of Mongolia, Genghis Khan is venerated as the founding father of the nation. And although, as I understand it, Mongolia is now a multi party democracy, I still think they keep something of a personality cult around this figure. Um, and that's interesting. Without question, this is a man who had a massive influence on world history. And it is a remarkable thing when you consider that he was an illiterate nomad and he went on to basically create the largest contiguous empire in history. Not the largest empire, that's the British Empire, but the largest contiguous empire. Um, and this legacy was carried on in his descendants, Ogadai Khan, Kublai Khan, and later on Tamerlane the Great, who claimed to be his descendant of Genghis Khan. Tamerlane was born in present day Uzbekistan. He was known as the Sword of Islam, the conqueror of the world. Now, there is some things to be said about Genghis Khan's rule. It said, for example, he was religiously tolerant. That's an interesting aspect. So religion was never a major factor in his conquests. As I understand it, he practiced Tingrinism. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but basically, the influence of the Mongol conquest was such that entire dynasties were changed. The landscape of countries was changed. Everywhere from Japan to Eastern Europe basically was in some way impacted by the Mongol conquests, roughly between 1220 and 1330. Not exact dates, but roughly that time. By all accounts, though, these conquests were extremely bloody. One of the most famous incidents was the sacking of Baghdad in 1258. That was actually by one of Khan's sons. I'm not sure if it was Ogedai Khan or Kublai Khan. Genghis Khan had died in 1228. So the sacking of Baghdad in 1258, they say 1 million people perished. Western sources say 800,000, Eastern sources 2 million. So let's say a round figure of about 1 million. It is true that Baghdad at the time was one of the world's largest cities, so the figure isn't entirely implausible, even if we take it to be an exaggeration. Some historians speculate as much as 11% of the entire world was wiped out through the Mongol conquests. And given that Genghis Khan was a patriarch of this, then that then comes down to his doorstep. But I think there's a number of things to consider. Firstly, it is important that we look at historical context. So it's difficult to judge a 13th century leader by 21st century standards. Without question, if Genghis Khan was around today, he would be called a war criminal. He'd be brought before the Hague and he'd spend the rest of his life in jail, and rightly so. But it is important to consider that in the 13th century, this was a time where basically such concepts as human rights and the morality of imperialism and so forth and so on were really not established in any sense of international law, barely even in national law. It was basically a very harsh, rough time of kill or be killed. I think that's a fair statement. And that's not to vindicate some of the things he done, but I think it is important to look at that context. That is why, um, if we look at the 20th century figures like Stalin and Mao Zedong, the reason they are rightly seen as brutal tyrants is because we are judging them by the context of their time, i.e., 20th century, modern times. Both men, Stalin and Mao, were active at a time that was less so than today, but nevertheless a more interconnected world than the time of Genghis Khan. And both men operated at a time, okay, Stalin a bit before, but throughout the war years and afterwards, at a time when the UN was being adopted and such principles as human rights were starting to come into the fore. I mean, Mao committed his most heinous crimes at the same time as we were sending people to space in the digital television age. So it's very, very, very difficult to argue any sort of contextual situation with someone like Chairman Mao, whom I have studied. With Genghis Khan, it becomes a bit more complex. Um, but I also want to make a point with this. If we're going to hold the standards that the Mongol conquests, as some argue, the defenders of Genghis Khan argue, they brought about a greater good because they ended up consolidating entire peoples, they united entire nations, and they established entire dynasties. I mean, the Yuan dynasty in China was Mongol based. Um, if you're going to use that argument, then you would have to use exactly the same argument for the British Empire, which is the only empire in history that surpassed the Mongols in sheer size. Not as a contiguous empire, but in overall size, the British Empire was slightly larger. I believe at our peak, the British Empire was 21 million square kilometres. The Mongols was about 18 or 19 million square kilometres. So the British Empire was by far the most extensive empire in human history. And yet today, even in the UK, it's a dirty word. It's seen as we look at the British Empire in the context of colonialism and exploitation and so forth and so on. And anyone who kind of defends it is seen as neo-colonialist and racist even. I think that's a very lazy view of history. If you're going to hold these standards for the Mongol Empire, you have to then look at all the things that came out of the British Empire, the Westminster system of government, the rule of law, educational institutions, railways, and okay, you can look at how they were built. You can say it was based on exploitation, but the Mongols done exactly the same thing in terms of not exactly the same thing, but I'm talking about this notion that Genghis Khan was just this wise old man who built a benevolent empire without bloodshed, or when people try to excuse that bloodshed, they're oh, but he was religiously tolerant, therefore it's okay. There has to be a consistency in standards with this. Um, Incidentally, when the Chinese talk about criticizing imperialism, that is complete rank hypocrisy. The fact of the matter is, the Han people have a very long history of conquest themselves. All the great powers in history are guilty of this. None of the great powers can claim to be innocent of conquering other lands. China today loves to hold itself up as being completely innocent in this regard. That's utterly disingenuous. You can look at many, many, many examples in history. Not only were successive Chinese dynasties ruthlessly crushed, various uprisings like the Dungan Revolt of the 1870s, but if you look at basically modern day China and its boundaries, and I'm not going to get into a thing about what is Chinese and what isn't, but the fact remains that the Han dominated Chinese power has basically been based on assimilating or forcing assimilation of Han people into non Han areas, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Inner Mongolia. Now, it has to be said that today relations in those areas are have a mixed record. There are many examples, and I have personally spoken to people. In fact, I knew a guy, a Chinese citizen, who was ethnically Mongol. He was from Inner Mongolia. He actually said to me that if he had a choice of living in modern Mongolia or being seen as Chinese, he would choose Chinese. So when it comes to empire and power, very few things really are black and white. That's the point I would like to make with this video, and that applies to every great power in history, whether it be the Mongol Empire, the British Empire, China, Russia, the United States, whatever, or if we want to expand this out, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Roman Empire. Sometimes, incidentally, you hear modern day Italians and defenders of Rome saying it was the most powerful empire in history. I think the reasoning for that is because it lasted so long, longer than the Mongols or the British, but wasn't as extensive. I mean, Rome at its peak was pretty big. It had most of the Mediterranean, large chunks of northern Europe, and large chunks of North Africa. But that was still significantly smaller than either the British or Mongol empires at their peak. So I think this claim that Rome was the most powerful empire in history. In fact, I saw that in an audio-visual sort of display when I visited Rome. The reasoning for it comes down to the fact that it was very long lasting. But the truth is, every great empire had its influence on the world, and none of the great powers can claim to be innocent. And there is no black and white, in my opinion, with any of the great powers of history. There's no black and white. You have to look at everything from both good and bad. And by extension to that, the great figures of history, including Genghis Khan, are complex. But what I would contend is that whatever achievements great figures have, it shouldn't overshadow their crimes against humanity as we would see it in the modern context. And I said a bit earlier in the video it would be wrong to judge Genghis Khan by the standards of today, but at the very least, people shouldn't deny what happened. They shouldn't pretend that he was entirely benevolent. The man was a conqueror. Millions of innocent people died at the hands of his Mongol hordes. This is a fact, even if you take it to be an exaggeration. So even if you consider that 40 million is an exaggeration, it was absolutely goes into the millions simply by the demographics and by the sheer common sense. If an empire extended as great as that, then by logic, many people would have died. Incidentally, some of the those who analyze Alexander the Great actually done something similar. He unified the people he conquered in the same way that Genghis Khan unified the tribes and then showed religious tolerance, which is in contrast to his successor further down the line, Timur Lenk or Tamerlane the Great. Anyway, this is all very fascinating. I can't make a very extensive video about it because, frankly, it's too complex and there would be too much to say. But if you can, check out both or either of these films. They're not films that are easy to find. I find them in CEX, which is a sort of discount store that occasionally sells foreign films. Of the two, I think Mongol is better. It's a bit more consistent. I found By the Will of Genghis Khan to be a bit badly directed. The choreography was all over the place. It wasn't quite consistent. So of the two films, I'd say Mongol was better. But they're both watchable, and they both definitely give the impression of the sort of complex leader that he was. Although to be fair, they're both presenting him in a very positive light. They're not really. And modern day Mongolia has statues and to him. There is something of a personality cult there. Um, I believe, in fact, it's a point of major cultural sensitivity to say anything against Genghis Khan. So, that shows even in democracies that there is a questionable track record on being totally transparent about historical figures. And to be fair, it would be there's probably figures in British history that would be along those lines. Perhaps Churchill. Um, it's there is sort of a consensus in Britain that he's a great leader and no one questions him. Although we do have some debates on some of the more questionable aspects of Churchill's personality. Anyway, I'll leave it there. This is a very interesting subject. There's a lot to be said from it. I've only laid out the very basics. So this wasn't intended to be a very deeply comprehensive academic video. It's just laying out the basics. Let me know your thoughts.